The flour tin hit the kitchen floor at 9:30 on a Tuesday, and no one in the town of Harrow Creek lifted a finger. Not because they didn't hear it. They heard everything in a town that small. The walls of the old Drummond house were pine and plaster, not stone, and sound traveled through them the way water travels through cracked clay. Slow at first, then all at once, soaking into every neighboring wall, every shared fence post, every Sunday morning pew. They heard the tin hit. They heard what came after. And by morning, when Lavinia Drummond appeared at the Mercantile with a bruise, the color of storm clouds pressed beneath her left eye, the women of Harrow Creek studied the bolts of calico on the shelves, and the men found something urgent to say to one another about the price of grain. She had been 21 years old when she married Clement Drummond. 21 and foolish and desperate, in the particular way that daughters of broken men tend to be desperate. Not reckless, but cornered. Her father, a surveyor named Orville Hatch, had spent the better part of 3 years dissolving himself in rye whiskey after her mother passed, and what remained of him by the spring of 1881 was a man-shaped debt held together by pride and poor decisions. Clement Drummond had offered to absorb those debts entirely. All he wanted in return was Lavinia's hand and the appearance of a respectable household on the edge of the Nebraska sandhills. He was 44 years old. He owned the town's feed store, a stretch of grazing land that bordered 3 other families' properties, and the note on the Harrow Creek livery stable. He was not a handsome man, but he dressed carefully and spoke in measured tones, and had the kind of stillness about him that Lavinia had mistaken, in those first bewildered weeks, for steadiness. She learned soon enough that it wasn't stillness at all. It was coil, like a watch spring wound too tight, waiting. The first time was 6 weeks into the marriage. She had burned the cornbread. Not badly, just the bottom edge, slightly. But Clement had set down his fork with a precise, deliberate click against the tin plate and looked at her across the table with those flat gray eyes of his, and she had known, even before he stood up, that something irrevocable was about to happen. He hit her with his open hand, once, across the cheek. Then he sat back down and finished his meal. That night, lying in the dark and listening to his breathing slow into sleep beside her, Lavinia pressed her fingers against the burning side of her face and told herself it would not happen again. She told herself this with the sincere and desperate conviction of someone who needs very badly to believe a lie. It happened again. 2 years and 4 months passed in that house on Crane Road, and in that time Lavinia Drummond became an expert in the private language of her husband's moods. A certain set to his jaw when he came in from the feed store meant the afternoon had gone poorly. The sound of his boots on the porch steps, whether he took them slow or fast, told her everything she needed to know about how to arrange herself before he came through the door. She learned to keep the lamps low. She learned to have his supper ready at 6 sharp, and his coffee poured before he sat down. She learned how to hold her ribs still when she breathed, so the cracked ones wouldn't grind, and she learned how to cover the marks with high collars and long sleeves in August, which was its own particular kind of suffering. The town of Harrow Creek knew. Not in the way people claim not to know. They knew the way people know when they have made a collective decision to look away. Deputy Harlan Pruitt had come to the house once, after the neighbor's boy had run to fetch him because of the sound of breaking glass and a woman screaming. Pruitt had stood in Lavinia's kitchen, turning his hat in his hands, while Clement smiled pleasantly from the doorway and explained that his wife was prone to nervous episodes. Pruitt had looked at Lavinia, at the split lower lip she was pressing a dishcloth to, and then looked back at Clement, and then looked at his hat. "You folks have a good evening," Pruitt had said, and walked back down the porch steps to his horse. Clement had waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before he turned around. The beating she received that night left her unable to walk without pain for 9 days. What broke her, in the end, was not a single blow but an accumulation. The way suffering will do eventually, not like a snapped branch, but like a riverbank, giving way by inches, until one morning you look and there's nothing left. By the second autumn of her marriage, the girl who had once kept a pressed flower journal and sung to herself while she hung laundry had gone somewhere Lavinia could no longer locate. What remained went through the motions of living, cooked, cleaned, mended, endured, but did it from a great and quiet distance, the way a person watches themselves from across a room. She stopped praying for rescue. She started praying, instead, for the cold to take her, or for Clement to simply misjudge himself one night. He never did. He was too controlled for that. He needed her upright and functioning, someone to keep the house and maintain the appearance of a settled, prosperous man. He was careful the way a man is careful with a tool he intends to go on using. The October that changed everything began like every other October in the sandhills, with a sky the color of pewter and a wind that came off the high plains like a judgment. Clement had ridden out to Broken Bow on business, something to do with a land dispute on his northern parcel, and he had returned 2 days early in a fury that Lavinia felt before she heard his horse in the yard. She was at the window when she saw him dismount, and the way he threw the reins at the fence post, not tied them, threw them, told her everything. She was standing at the sink when he came through the door. He didn't speak. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and hit her so hard she went down against the cast iron stove, catching her shoulder on the corner of it, and the world went white with pain, and then gray, and then she was on the floor. And she could smell the wood smoke and the lye soap and the cold coming in through the open door behind him, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "I cannot do this again." He dragged her up by the arm. He was saying something, about the land, about the men in Broken Bow, about her uselessness, but the words came to her underwater, distorted and distant, because the pain in her shoulder had gone from sharp to a deep, nauseating wrongness that meant something was broken or pulled badly out of place. She tried to stand, and her legs didn't cooperate. "Worthless," Clement said. The word landed the way his words always landed, quiet, precise, aimed. "I have carried you for 2 years, and you can't even stand up straight." He shoved her toward the back door, opened it, and threw her out onto the back step. In October, without her coat, the cold hit her like a wall. She landed hard on her hands and knees on the frozen ground and lay there for a moment, shaking, not from cold, but from the particular exhaustion of someone who has been afraid for too long. She heard him throw the bolt from the inside. He had done this before, put her outside to freeze for an hour or two as a demonstration of something she was never entirely sure of. His control, her helplessness, some accounting only he could see. But this time the temperature was dropping fast, and the sky in the west had gone an ugly yellowish gray that the old-timers in Harrow Creek called a snow sky. She was crouched against the back of the house, arms wrapped around herself, when she heard the sound from the road. A horse moving slow, then voices, one, then another, and then the creak of a loaded wagon. The man driving the wagon had no particular reason to turn down Crane Road. He had been aiming for the livery stable on the main thoroughfare, intending to stable his horse for the night and find somewhere dry to wait out whatever weather was coming down from the north. His name was Matthias Cord, and he had not been to a town this size in 11 months. He had spent those 11 months working a trap line in the sandhills above the Loop River, speaking to no one and preferring it that way, coming down to civilization only when his salt and his coffee ran out and he had enough pelts to trade. He was not a man who looked for trouble. He was, in fact, a man who had spent the better part of a decade trying to put trouble behind him. The war, the years after the war, the things a man does in lean times that he does not wish to account for in fat ones. He had come to the sandhills for their silence, and had found, to his quiet satisfaction, that they delivered on that promise entirely. The land out there did not care what you had done or who you had been. It only cared whether you were paying attention. He was paying attention when he turned the corner onto Crane Road. He saw the woman first. She was crouched in the frozen dirt behind a house, arms wrapped around her chest, no coat, no hat. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since noon. He pulled the wagon to a stop without thinking about it, the way you stop when you see an animal caught in something. Not a decision so much as a reflex. Matthias Cord was a large man, built in the wide-shouldered, economical way of someone who has spent years working with his hands and his back, and very little else. His face was weather-darkened, half hidden behind a beard gone thick with the season, and his eyes were a pale, almost colorless green that had a habit of seeing things plainly. He was not a man who dealt in pretense or ceremony. He was a man who dealt in what was in front of him. What was in front of him was a woman shivering in the dirt. He climbed down from the wagon. "Ma'am," he said. He didn't say anything else. He had learned, in years of moving through a world that did not always welcome men of his size and his quiet, that offering too many words too fast tended to frighten people. He crouched down to her level. She flinched back hard, and he went still. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "You're going to freeze out here." She looked at him. Her lip was split. Her shoulder was held at an angle that told him immediately something was wrong with it. Her eyes were the particular kind of hollow that comes not from a single bad night, but from a long time of bad nights, one stacked on the next until the weight of them changes a person's face. "My husband," she started. "I know," Matthias said. He didn't know the specifics. He didn't need them. He had seen enough of the world to understand the shape of this. "Can you stand?" she tried. Her legs shook badly. He offered his arm, and she hesitated for a moment. That terrible hesitation of someone whose trust has been systematically destroyed. And then she took it. The back door opened. Clement Drummond filled the doorframe. He took in the scene. His wife standing upright, a stranger's hand on her arm, and his face went through several things in rapid succession before settling on the controlled, dangerous calm that Lavinia knew better than to mistake for anything good. "That's my wife," Clement said. Matthias Cord turned and looked at him. He took his time about it. "I can see she's had a bad evening," Matthias said. "That is no concern of yours." Clement stepped down off the back step. He was a solid man, and he carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being the largest authority in any given room. "I'd advise you to get back on your wagon and go." "I'll go," Matthias said. "She's coming with me." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it, the held breath kind, the kind that comes before weather. Clement moved fast for a man his age. He went for the gun belt hanging just inside the door, and he had his hand on the revolver before Matthias closed the distance between them. What happened next was brief and efficient and not particularly kind. Matthias caught Clement's gun arm at the wrist and turned it in a direction it was not designed to go. The revolver dropped. Clement's knees followed it. Matthias held him there for a moment. Not long, just long enough to make clear that this was a matter of physics and not of debate. "Deputy Pruitt," Matthias said, his voice conversational. "Is he the law here?" Lavinia, from behind him, said, "Such as it is." "Such as it is," Matthias repeated. He released Clement's arm, stepped back, and picked up the revolver. He emptied the cylinder, pocketed the cartridges, and set the empty gun on the fence post. Clement knelt in the frozen dirt, cradling his arm, his face dark red with a rage that had nowhere to go. "I will see you hanged," he breathed. "You have no idea who I am in this town." "I have a fairly good idea," Matthias said. He walked back to Lavinia. She was shaking still, cold and shock, and something that might distantly have been the beginning of a feeling she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. "There's a widow woman on the edge of town," Lavinia said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Genevieve Morse. She'd take me in for the night." Matthias was starting now, fine and dry, blowing sideways off the plains. "All right," he said. "Can you climb up?" She could, barely. He helped her without making much of it. They left Clement Drummond in the dirt of his own yard, and Matthias Cord drove Lavinia to the widow Morse's house on the east edge of Harrow Creek, and the snow came down and covered the ruts of the wagon wheels before morning. Genevieve Morse was 63 years old and had not survived the plains this long by being a woman who asked too many questions at the wrong time. She took one look at Lavinia, at the split lip and the held shoulder and the hollow eyes, and she took one look at the large, quiet man who had brought her, and she opened her door wide without a word. She set Lavinia's shoulder herself. She had set shoulders before. She had said a good many things in 63 years on the Nebraska plains, and she had the particular competence of a woman who had long since stopped waiting for someone else to do what needed doing. Lavinia bit down on a folded dishcloth and went gray, and then the sickening grind of the joint settling back into place was over, and the pain went from blinding to bearable, and Genevieve wrapped it tight and pressed a cup of hot coffee into Lavinia's good hand without ceremony. Matthias slept in the barn. In the morning, Harrow Creek woke to 6 inches of snow and a new set of problems. Clement Drummond had gone to Deputy Pruitt before dawn. The charge, Pruitt explained apologetically to Genevieve Morse through her front door, was assault and the unlawful removal of a man's wife. He had a county warrant. He would need to bring Mrs. Drummond back to the house on Crane Road. Genevieve Morse looked at Harlan Pruitt for a long moment. "She's not here," Genevieve said. She wasn't. Matthias had come to that decision some time before dawn, standing in the dark of the barn with the snow ticking against the roof, running through the options with the practical, unsentimental clarity of a man who has spent years making decisions alone in remote places. The options were not good. The law, such as it was in Harrow Creek, was in Clement Drummond's pocket. In the same way everything else in Harrow Creek was in Clement Drummond's pocket. Staying meant waiting for Pruitt to deliver Lavinia back to the house on Crane Road, which was not an option Matthias was willing to consider. He had come in from the barn at 4 in the morning and woken Lavinia with a knock on the doorframe. "Can you ride?" he asked. She thought about the shoulder. "Well enough," she said. They were gone before the town stirred. The sandhills in November are a particular kind of beautiful, cold and vast and emptied of anything that isn't essential, the hills rolling away in every direction under a sky so wide it seems less like weather and more like a geological feature. Matthias knew these hills the way he knew his own hands. He knew which draws offered shelter and which ones funneled wind, which creek beds stayed passable through early winter and which turned treacherous. He had a camp up in the high hills above the loop that he had been using for 3 seasons, a half dugout with a proper stove and a winter's worth of wood already split and stacked, and he aimed for it now with the focus of a man who has reduced the problem to its practical elements. Lavinia rode without complaint. Her shoulder hurt badly enough that she could feel her pulse in it with every step of the horse. But she had spent 2 years learning to manage pain quietly, and she managed this one the same way. She watched the landscape open up around her, the dead grass bent flat under the snow, the cottonwoods along the creek beds stripped bare, the sky going from gray to a thin, watery blue as the morning advanced, and felt something strange moving through her. Not happiness, not yet. Something earlier than that, something like the first creak of ice beginning to give in late February. The distant, dangerous suggestion of possibility. She did not speak much in those first days, neither did Matthias. They moved through the days of early winter with a companionable silence. That Lavinia had not known was possible between a man and a woman. Had not known because every silence she had spent in Clement's house had been a silence full of threat, the held breath quiet of waiting to see what would come next. This silence was different. This silence was simply quiet. Matthias taught her things, not because he announced he would teach her. He was not a man who announced things, but because he went about his work and she watched. And when she asked a question, he answered it plainly, and gradually the watching became doing. She learned to read the weather in the way the grass bent. She learned to keep the stove properly banked against a cold night. She learned to move through the hills without snapping every frozen stick underfoot, which took more patience than she expected, and which Matthias praised with a single nod that she found herself disproportionately pleased by. He did not touch her. He was careful about distances in a way that was deliberate without being awkward. A man who understood that a person could be frightened of proximity, even when they trusted the one causing it, and who was patient about that in the same steady way he was patient about everything. She was grateful for this, more than she knew how to say, and so she didn't say it, and it sat between them as an understood thing. In Harrow Creek, the understood thing was somewhat different. Clement Drummond's humiliation had curdled badly. He had told Deputy Pruitt, and through Pruitt the rest of the town, that Lavinia had been taken by force by a violent drifter with a known criminal history, which was the kind of story that was difficult to disprove and easy for people to believe if they needed something to believe that didn't implicate themselves. Some of the town believed it. Others, the ones who had heard things through the walls and looked away, found it harder to swallow but swallowed it anyway because the alternative required them to account for their own behavior. Two men were interested in the reward. Clement had posted it quietly through channels, $250 for information leading to the return of his wife and the location of the man who had taken her. The money drew a pair of brothers from down near the Republican River, men named Greer and Sewell Datchet, who had done this kind of work before, and who did not trouble themselves unduly with questions of justice or legitimacy. They were competent trackers in the way that men who do not care about the moral dimension of their work often are. Efficiently, without distraction, they picked up the trail in early December. Matthias found the signs of them 3 days before they arrived. A horse track in a sheltered draw that hadn't been there the day before, a disturbed patch of brush on the south ridge that didn't read like deer. He said nothing to Lavinia that first day. The second day he brought the extra rifle down from the wall of the dugout, a .44 Henry that he had carried for 11 years, and he set it on the table and looked at her. "You've been watching me with the traps," he said. "You know how to be still." "Yes," Lavinia said. "I need you to be still in a different way." He looked at her steadily, "And I need you to be able to use that if you have to." She had never fired a rifle. She said so. "You've got today," Matthias said. He spent the afternoon with her in the clearing below the dugout, walking her through it with the same unhurried precision he applied to everything. The weight of the gun, the way to seat the stock, how to breathe. She was a quick study because she was paying a kind of attention she had not paid to anything in years. The sharpened, whole-body attention of someone who understands that the information being offered is not theoretical. By evening, she could put a shot where she aimed it at 30 yards. The Datchet brothers came up the south ridge at first light on a Thursday, moving carefully, the way men do when they think they are being careful. What they did not account for was that the man they were tracking had spent a decade in these hills and knew every approach to his camp the way he knew the layout of his own hand. Matthias was above them on the ridge before they had cleared the tree line. He did not announce himself dramatically. He stepped out from behind a cedar with his buffalo rifle leveled and said, conversationally, "You're on my land." Greer Datchet, the elder brother, pulled up his horse hard. His hand went toward the rifle in his scabbard and then stopped when he assessed what he was looking at. "We're looking for a woman," he said, "and the man she's with. There's paper on both of them." "I know what the paper says," Matthias said. "I also know who wrote it and why." He kept the rifle easy, but it was the kind of easy that a man achieves when he is entirely comfortable with the thing he is holding. The woman you're looking for left that marriage with both eyes open and her own 2 feet. What Drummond put her through is the kind of business that makes sheriffs look the other way on account of being paid to look the other way. But I am not a sheriff, and I am not paid by anyone. The law, Sewell Datchet started. "The law in Harrow Creek is a tin star on a coward's chest," Matthias said. "You boys rode a long way for $250. I'd recommend you think about whether that's the right amount of money for the situation you're presently in." There was a long silence. The wind moved through the cedars. A hawk quartered overhead. "We didn't sign on for this," Greer said finally to his brother. "It was not a question." Sewell looked at Matthias for another moment. Then he looked at the ridge above the dugout, where Lavinia stood in the gray morning light with the Henry rifle seated against her shoulder, watching through the sights. "No," Sewell said, "we didn't." They turned their horses around and rode back the way they had come, without another word. Matthias watched them until they disappeared into the tree line below. Then he climbed down from the ridge to where Lavinia was standing. She lowered the rifle. Her arms were shaking slightly, not from fear, she recognized, but from the sustained effort of holding herself ready and then releasing it. She had been prepared to do what needed doing. She was grateful she had not needed to do it. "Will they go back to Clement?" she asked. "Maybe," Matthias said. "But I think they'll go back to the Republican River instead. Men who do that kind of work generally don't stay in a situation that's gotten complicated on them." He paused. "Drummond's going to have to come himself eventually, if he wants to come at all." "He won't come himself," Lavinia said. She said it with the certainty of someone who has studied a man for 2 years. "He's not brave. He's only powerful when there's no one left to object." She was right. Clement Drummond did not come. What he did instead was send a letter to the county seat in Broken Bow, alleging desertion and requesting a legal remedy for the recovery of his property, meaning Lavinia, though the letter did not use her name, referring to her only as the wife. The county took 6 weeks to respond, and the response, when it came, was addressed to Deputy Pruitt and was largely inconclusive, recommending that the matter be resolved at the local level and noting that without evidence of a crime, no state resources would be deployed. Deputy Pruitt filed the letter. The matter, for all practical purposes in the eyes of Burt County, Nebraska, was closed. Lavinia did not learn any of this until February, when Genevieve Morse, who had more information channels than the town gave her credit for, sent word through a cattle drover who knew where Matthias's camp was. The letter arrived, tied around a bundle of dried apples, and 3 back issues of a newspaper from Omaha, which Genevieve had included because she thought Lavinia might want to know what was happening in the wider world. Lavinia read the newspaper by the light of the stove. Then she set it down and sat for a while looking at the fire. "Genevieve says Clement's already talking about bringing in a new housekeeper," she said. Matthias was cleaning the Henry at the table. He didn't look up. "Does that bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "It bothers me for whoever she is." Matthias set the oiling cloth down. "We could go back," he said. He said it carefully, laying it out like a fact for her to inspect, not a suggestion. "Not to Harrow Creek, to Broken Bow, to the county. There are federal circuits that don't answer to Drummond's money. The things that happened in that house, with a proper account from a woman willing to give one, in writing, to the right people. Would they listen?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe not. Maybe some of them." He picked up the cloth again. "You'd have to decide if you wanted to find out." She was quiet for a long time. "I don't want to go back," she said, finally. "I don't want to stand in front of men who knew what was happening and pretended otherwise and explain myself to them." She paused. "But I want what happened to be true. I don't want it to be something I carry around like it was a secret I'm ashamed of." Matthias looked at her. "Write it down," he said. "All of it. Date it. Sign it. I'll witness it." He reached under the bunk and produced a water-damaged but serviceable journal he'd been using for weather records. He set it on the table. "You don't have to give it to anyone yet, but it exists. It's yours." She pulled the journal toward her. She opened it to a clean page. She wrote for 3 hours that night while Matthias kept the fire and stayed out of the way. She wrote about the silver spoon and the first blow. She wrote about Pruitt and the $20 bill and the belt. She wrote about the back step in October and the night she lay on the frozen ground and thought she couldn't do it anymore. She wrote carefully and specifically and without decoration. because she had been trained by 2 years of survival to be accurate about the things that mattered. When she finished, she closed the journal and set it on the shelf above the stove. Spring came to the sandhills the way it always did. Grudgingly at first, then all at once. The snow melted off the south-facing hills in March, and by April the whole country was running water, the draws full of snowmelt and the cottonwoods throwing out the first faint blush of green against the brown of the hills. Matthias sold his winter pelts at the trading post in Dunning in early April, and when he came back he brought 3 things: a sack of flour, a letter from Genevieve Morse, and a folded newspaper. The newspaper had a small article on the 4th page about a federal investigation into land fraud in Custer County, Nebraska. It mentioned, in passing, a man named Clement Drummond of Harrow Creek, who was among several individuals whose land dealings were being examined in connection with a complaint filed by the Broken Bow Land Office the previous fall. Lavinia read the article twice. Then she folded the newspaper along its original creases and set it on the shelf next to the journal. She thought about Clement for the first time in months, without the particular cold terror that had accompanied every thought of him for 2.5 years. She thought about him as what he actually was: a frightened, greedy, small man who had needed to destroy things smaller than himself in order to feel large. She thought about the house on Crane Road, the heavy bolt on the back door, the way he had thrown her into the October cold like a piece of furniture he was done with. She did not feel anything that resembled grief. She felt something that resembled the straightening of a spine. Genevieve's letter was addressed to both of them. It said, in Genevieve's characteristically economic prose, that Clement Drummond had dismissed his housekeeper after 3 weeks and was currently in some difficulty with the county regarding the land matter. It said that Deputy Pruitt had tendered his resignation in March, the reasons for which were not specified, but which Genevieve found interesting. It said that several of the women of Harrow Creek had begun, quietly, to speak to one another about what they had known and not said, and that the Reverend's wife had written a letter to the County Women's Charitable Society about the matter. It said, "You don't have to come back, but if you do, there would be people glad to see you." Lavinia stood in the doorway of the dugout with the letter in her hand and looked out over the sandhills rolling away to the south. The hills she had learned by now to read like a language. She could name the grasses. She could tell you which draws held water and which didn't. She could move through this country without announcing herself, which was something she had not known, at 21, that she needed to know. She was 24 years old. She had stopped counting her age at some point in the first winter, when counting it had felt like counting losses, and had only recently begun again, and found that it felt different now. Not a subtraction, but an accounting. Matthias came up from the creek with a bucket and stopped when he saw her in the doorway. He looked at the letter and then at her face. "Good news or complicated news?" he asked. "Complicated," she said, "which is probably better than the alternative." He set the bucket down and came to stand beside her. They looked out over the hills together for a moment, the way people look at landscape when they are actually thinking about something else. "She says there would be people glad to see me," Lavinia said. "What do you want?" Matthias asked. "Not what do you need, not what should you do. What do you want?" As if the question were simple. As if she were a person whose wants were worth asking about. She had been thinking about this since February, since the night she had written the journal by firelight and felt something rearrange itself inside her that had been badly out of place for a long time. She had been thinking about it in the way you think about a path you haven't taken yet, knowing it's there, not sure of the footing, uncertain what's on the other side, but beginning to suspect it might be navigable. "I want to go to Broken Bow," she said. "I want to give the journal to the Federal Land Office, and I want to give a copy of it to the county courthouse, and I want to sign my name to it where people can see it." She paused. "And then I think I'd like to come back here." Matthias was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the new grass on the hillside. "All right," he said. They left the following week. Matthias drove, and Lavinia held the journal in her lap, the one on the shelf above the stove. She had added to it through the winter. Not new events, but missing details she'd remembered, dates she'd pinned down, the name of the Irish maid who had witnessed things and been afraid to speak. She had been thorough. She had been, she thought, as honest as language allowed. At the Broken Bow courthouse, a clerk with wire-rimmed spectacles and a manner suggesting he had seen a great deal of the world without being particularly impressed by it, took her statement and her journal and her signed affidavit without comment, stamping each page with the county seal and filing them in a folder with her name on the tab. He told her the federal investigation was ongoing and that her account would be added to the existing file. He told her these things would be entered into the record. She stood on the courthouse steps in the April sunshine afterward, and she felt the weight of the journal leaving her hands. Not the physical journal, which she kept, but the weight of carrying the thing alone. The truth of what had happened in the house on Crane Road now existed in a filed, stamped, sealed document in a government building, and whatever happened to it from here, she had not let it be a secret. Matthias was waiting at the bottom of the steps with the horses. He handed her the reins without a word. They rode back toward the sandhills in the long, late afternoon light, the sun going orange behind them, the hills ahead settling into the blue-green of early spring evening. The meadowlarks were out, calling from the fence posts along the road, and the air smelled of wet earth and new grass and something she couldn't name that might have simply been the smell of a season turning over. Lavinia did not look back toward Harrow Creek. The house on Crane Road and the man inside it, and the 2 years of her life she had spent surviving them, would go on, existing whether she looked at them or not, and she had already decided that she was not obligated to spend any more of herself in that direction. She had given what she owed, to the record, to the truth, to the women who came after, who might need to know someone had said something. That account was settled. What she carried forward was lighter. Not light. She was not naive about what she was carrying forward, and she did not pretend otherwise, but lighter. The difference between a stone in your coat pocket and a stone in your hands where you can see it. The sandhills opened up ahead of them, wide and unhurried and indifferent in the way that only very old, very patient land can be. She had been afraid of this country when she first came into it. She was not afraid of it now. She knew how to read it. She knew where the shelter was and where the water ran, and how to move through it without announcing herself unnecessarily to the things that might be listening. She knew in a way she had not known since she was a girl singing to herself over the wash line what it was to be inside her own life rather than waiting for it to be done with her. The horses moved at an easy pace. The meadowlarks called and fell silent and called again. The light went from orange to rose to the particular deep, transparent blue that comes just before dark, when the sky still holds the day's warmth, but the stars are beginning to consider appearing. Matthias said nothing. He was a man who understood that some things did not require commentary. Lavinia rode beside him and let the country go by, and did not look back, and breathed.